So we'll start today's session. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for what is the fifth in a series of 6 webinars covering various aspects of pensions and finances on divorce. Just before I start, there's a couple of housekeeping points. Firstly, I'd like to thank Jeremy and Anthony for joining us as facilitators. They'll be monitoring the chat box as I go through this webinar this morning to hopefully answer any questions that you have. At the end of the webinar, several things will happen. First of all, we'll keep the session open for any questions that you have at the end of the webinar. Jeremy and Anthony will also be highlighting any questions that have arisen which are of perhaps interest to the wider audience that we'll then debate. And I'll also be posting a SurveyMonkey questionnaire, as always, to gauge your feedback. If you'd be kind enough to give that 2 minutes of your time. And you'll also be sent a copy and a recording of these slides by email at the end of this session. So you'll have all of that stuff to love and cherish. And I think that's housekeeping bits. So the topic of today's session is, if I can get to the slide, pension offsetting and the Chamber Affairs. So pension offsetting is one of the topics that was voted for in an earlier survey we did. As many of you, I think, appreciate that offsetting is perhaps one of the more obscure and debated aspects of divorce. The Chamber of Fear bit, no idea where that came from, but I guess it came from the fact that many seminars or webinars, I'm sure both you and I have attended, have regularly focused on the litigious aspects of offsetting, and I expect many of you will tread carefully in this area. And I also happen to note, for some unknown reason, I Googled Chamber of Fears and can inform you that it's a pair of trainers as well as the topic of my webinar. So there you go. The agenda today isn't necessarily going to be in this order, but I hope to be getting to cover all these points. And I'm going to be majoring on looking at the PAG report. I'm going to referring throughout this to the PAG report for not only the definition of offsetting but for also how they approach it and so on and so forth. I'll also be talking about how we explain to clients offsetting and sharing finances on divorce, and also valuations. I talked about valuations in my last webinar, but in this sense, I'll be talking to you about what they mean in relation to offsetting. I've got a couple of worked examples, and I'm also going to be talking about tax and utility as I go through, and why you should be considering using a PODE, particularly in offsetting. And my one slide on Blue Sky is, of course, here are the client-facing advisors who are importantly supported by our admin and power planning team. And in the world of pension sharing work that we do, having a robust admin team who know the process of collating data and timescales and stuff like that is enormously important and valuable. And in the 20-something years we've been doing pension sharing reports, that's been important. You'll notice that we are members of Resolution. Rob and I have got the specialist accreditation, and Mike, who recently joined us, is going through the membership process. We also do a lot of shadow expert work. So our work back in 2000 just started really with pension sharing reports, developing pension sharing reports. We do a lot of shadow expert work, which often, of course, will be single instructions to help you and your client work their way through the financial aspects and pension aspects of a divorce settlement. So as I say, I'll be focusing on, in particular, part 7 of the PAG report, the dominant practice, pension offsetting, as it's titled. And we have had a couple of questions in the past about what did we mean by the PAG report. Well, as you'll see, it's the Pensions Advisory Group, and the PAG report was produced after an earlier document some of you might well have read called, I'm not sure this is full title, but it was called Apples and Pears and then something else, but it was headed by Barrister Rhys Taylor. And that report identified that different pension experts approach pension sharing in different ways. And so the PAG report aimed to introduce some common practices amongst the pensions experts, and also, I guess, to take the lid off this area of work so that those who use pension sharing reports could work with them more efficiently and effectively. And the PAG report seems to now be gaining some weight and authority. It was developed by a committee of IFAs, so financial planners who are specialists in this area. Family lawyers, pension lawyers, barristers, actuaries, there's mediators, there were judges, a couple of academics, and a QC. All within that body who produced this rather splendid document. The foreword was by Andrew McFarlane, who commended it to all judges as formal guidance to be applied in pension sharing work. And as many of you will know, it's already been quoted in some judgments. So do read it, and if time is tight for you, we would recommend that at least you read this at the beginning of each section. There is key points, a good summary of what's to follow, and certainly gives you a good understanding of what's in the PAG report. The definition it gives of offsetting is, of course, you're trading pension assets for money or capital, and that's what we're going to be going through today. It majors on the point that, of course, the CE that you get for pensions is often not a reliable comparator for divorce purposes, and that's a thread I think that's run through all my webinars, that never, get the CE, because sometimes it's a figure you've got to deal with and you've got to share, but it's often not a reliable comparator for divorce purposes, whether that's equality of income or indeed offsetting. And to endorse this point, this is a lifted example from the PAG report, where we have a husband and wife, both age 60, just about to retire. One's in a DB scheme, a public sector scheme, and the other has a personal pension with Scottish Widows, so a DC scheme. They're both valued at £300,000. And what we've seen in the past is that sometimes lawyers have agreed, or even judges have agreed, well, the CEs are the same, you keep one scheme and he keeps the other, and off you go. And if you left things as they are, you would have created a scenario where actually the whole driving force of sharing pensions has not been achieved in an equality of income, with the wife getting 12,800, husband getting 6,800. You'll appreciate that there's an element of risk about that. And on the topic of litigation, of course, there is a section in the PAG report on litigation, because in particularly with offsetting, people must be clear, your clients must be clear about what they're gaining or losing by offsetting. And in fact, the negligence claims in this area are overwhelmingly where offsetting cases have been poorly considered. And I guess from what we've seen, sometimes you get scenarios where the husband, it said, the wife keeps the house, husband keeps the pension. There you go. It's about the same. It's about the same value, and off they go, only to discover perhaps many years later, that that wasn't really a good outcome, a fair outcome, and it might come back to bite you. And it makes a point, of course, that pensions and capital assets, so investments or money in a or property equity, are two very different classes, have to be treated differently. And I hope the content in this webinar will help you understand that a bit further. It also talks about the D81, and we've had a few questions in past webinars about the D81, and the PAG comments that actually the D81 is not really fit for purpose in this world where there are lots of other alternatives to just plain pension sharing. And the point the PAG report makes is, okay, we've got to work with the D81 for the time being, but it's okay to put other documentation with Form D81 because there's not enough space to write all the stuff you'd want to put on a D81. And indeed, if you've taken offsetting advice, it might be appropriate to add the nature of any advice taken as an addendum to the Form D81, certainly explaining the reason behind the offsetting. And a question we had in our previous webinar on valuations, where I made the point on this slide, and I don't want to, don't worry too much about this other than this aspect, that here was a pension sharing case I discussed last time, where it was clear that the direction of pension share would go from the husband, these are the husband's assets, to the wife. And because of this direction of travel, this valuation was completely not relevant. We didn't need to know it. We only needed to know the income which a teacher scheme was going to pay, and that's much more readily accessible than the CE. And so on your D81, you could just put not applicable because of the direction of pension share. So that was just a little bit of additional information on the D81. If I return to the reasons for pension offsetting, well, the one we see most often, and I'm sure you come across most often, is the family home. And one party or the other would like to keep the family home. Sometimes it might be something else like the business premises that they want to retain, but typically the family home. We also see where some pension schemes offer such poor value for money in terms of the quoted CE that we look to use offsetting as a way of not having to share quite so much of that poorly valued pension. And I've got a worked example on that in a moment. And last week, I talked about a SIP, a pension asset with a commercial property in it. And this would be one reason where you might not be able to share that pension because it's got an illiquid, maybe a commercial property in that SIP, and therefore you might have to consider some sort of offsetting instead of pension sharing. We deal with with overseas pensions occasionally, which can't be shared, so therefore offsetting relevant there. And the final 2 points, 5 and 6, which the PAG note, I don't think has ever seen this sort of scenario for a long time. Yes, sometimes pension sharing can be expensive, but not normally expensive to the degree that one has to consider offsetting rather than pension sharing. And of course, if the divorce petition was issued before the 1st of December 2000, then pension sharing wasn't available, so offsetting may be relevant there. And a couple of extra points which the PAG report makes. Of course, if there isn't enough assets to offset, then you can't do it, which is blindingly obvious, I suppose. Offsetting may be the only option if all the other assets are not available for sharing. And one of the examples I have coming up is that partial offsetting may be considered. So it's not, offsetting isn't all the pensions or nothing. It can be part of the pensions. And it again makes a point that this wonderful term they have, PODE, or Pension on Divorce Expert, they say a PODE report is usually needed in offsetting cases because, and certainly in the big money cases, the rights that can be given up are significant. I'm just going to move on now to the way we describe offsetting, and indeed all sharing of finances during divorce, to, if you like, Joe Public. And this is because we get quite a lot of referrals from mediators where the clients want to come in and talk to us about how assets should be divided. We also have a occasional client in person, and we will write in our meeting rooms. We've got whiteboards, and we'll draw this on the whiteboard to say, look, you've been through all this, noting your assets and what they are, but let's try and simplify it. So all your assets can be combined in these three boxes. So you've got the family home at the top, which obviously is a sort of asset on its own, really, and then investments can all go in that box, and pensions go in a pension box, and that the investment box can include deposits, shares, buy-to-let properties, whatever. And of course, the starting premise is we look to divide everything equally, unless subsequently there's good reason to deviate from it. But that's the starting premise. I always draw a line above pensions because, of course, the money above the line, the assets above the line, can be shared on a pound-for-pound basis because they're capital, they're realisable, generally realisable capital. And below the line, you should always look to share a pension based on the division of income, the creation of equality. And of course, then from that basis, we can say, well, if in this example, if a wife would like more of the family home, then the husband could have more of the pension. And that's the whole offsetting premise. And indeed, of course, if it's not the family home, it might be what money is in their investments that they might be using to offset. Instead, it's not always, obviously, it's not always the family home. And the question is, which is where the examples I've got, which are coming up, hopefully answer is, well, how do we approach things if, for example, someone wants to retain capital through the family home or other investments, or how do you deal with it if someone wants to retain pension income because the pension income aspect is very important? So how do we deal with that? And as a sort of segue into the mathematical bit, which I'm going to head into now, is the PAG report talks about the pension offsetting process being as described there, where the first step is you value the asset, and that's not the same as getting the cash equivalent. It'll be our own valuation of that asset generally compared with how much it would cost to buy those pension benefits on the open market, and we'll come on to that in a moment. There may well be adjustment for tax, which is where it gets a bit complex, and on occasion there's adjustment for utility, but I think you would find that most pension on divorce experts would step away from that, because that is normally the domain of the court to decide that. And I think, again, in the opinion of most pension on divorce experts, the utility argument is perhaps a bit of a historic argument when pensions were a lot less flexible than they are now, and there was, in some cases, an advantage in having cash over money in a pension. That's hence the utility bit. And as part of this mathematical area I'm going to head into, I just want to have a moment to consider some information which will help with my next example, and that is quite simply, many of you will know this, but if you have a personal pension so a defined contribution type pension, and you pay £100 into it, the revenue will add 20% tax relief. So in this example, if you pay £100 in, they give you £25. And before you say, well, that's 25% of 100, not 20, the tax relief is based on the gross amount invested. The maths to work that out is shown on the bottom right. So, the point I want to make here is that if you've got £100 cash in your pocket, through this methodology of funding a pension, it is worth £125 within a pension. There's that relationship which is the basis of this next illustration. Again, going back to my my boxes, and let's say that the total equity in the family home is £500,000. That, of course, means that both have £250,000 of equity in the family home. And let's say that the wife has decided she wants to keep the whole property. And in that instance, it means in my speak that the wife has actually retained £250,000 of the husband's money. And bear with me on this bit, if the husband had retained £250,000, and let's say that the family home had been sold, there were no other housing requirements, but he had got £250,000 and he'd put it into a pension based on my formula on the earlier slide. That pension that £250,000 would have been grossed up in the pension to £312,500. And therefore, one can summarize that by saying, well, actually, if the wife keeps £250,000 of the property equity, the husband could keep £312,500 of extra pension. And I guess that might be DC benefits. I'll come on to the final salary stuff in a minute, but that's one aspect of looking at this. The issues of this is where I'm going to shoot holes in that previous example, is that it might be quite difficult for the husband to fund £250,000 or £312,000 into a pension, because he's going to break his annual allowance. He'd have to have fairly specific circumstances to be able to carry forward enough unused pension allowance to be able to fund a pension to that extent. But of course, he could do that over several years. So it is a possibility worth considering. The other issue with that is that the husband may well be a high rate taxpayer. And if the husband wanted to spend a net amount of £250,000 towards pension contributions, it would mean that he would effectively be able to get £416,000 in a pension. So there's a different aspect there on pension offsetting. And a point I'm going to be making quite a few times is that if we understand your client's position, we can often tailor the best method of offsetting to the case we're given. So a letter of instruction which has a bit of context, for instance, ages, salaries, other assets that are present, that can be enormously helpful. And certainly in this example, because of the limitations of pension funding, this style of offsetting may only work with smaller offset amounts. And that will, of course, be for the pension on divorce expert to identify. If we look at this from another aspect, so the same scenario where the wife is keeping the £250,000, but we're saying, okay, if again the property was sold and she had kept all the money, what income could the wife generate with £250,000? So let's look at it from an income perspective. Well, I'm going to introduce this concept of purchase life annuity. And a purchase life annuity is an income stream you purchase with a lump of money, not a lump of pension money. So they are annuities in the sense that they will provide you with a guaranteed income for the rest of your life, but they are purchased out of non-pension capital. And so if you have a purchase life annuity rate of 3%, and I'm making this up a bit, you could buy an income of £7,500, and therefore in this case, if the wife wanted to keep the property, the husband would be able to get £7,500 of extra income. Without frying your brains completely, there is an additional tax consideration here, which would be relevant and would adjust our figures, but I've left that out of this consideration for the time being. So if I then just dive back into the PAG report just to extract something else, and this is a concept called DCFE, which I will explain because it'll help with my next examples. And this is lifting an example from some of my previous webinars I've run, where here we have a John Lewis pension scheme. The husband's got a John Lewis pension scheme. The wife doesn't have anything. John Lewis has said that the CE is worth £300,000 and will pay an indexed income of £12,000 per annum. And this, of course, is what John Lewis have decided the value is, but the PAG report, again in section 7, talks about the defined contribution fund equivalent. This is a defined benefit fund, and if we say, well, okay, well, that's all well and good, John Lewis saying that, but what if I wanted to buy £12,000 per annum as a pension on the open market with a pension fund, and the DCFE, or something I've referred to in previous webinars, is the true value, because some of you in your letters of instruction ask for true value. The true value of this John Lewis scheme is £435,000, because £435,000 in a pension fund could buy an index annuity income of £12,000 per annum. Now, we need to know that. I've talked about this before. We need to know that. Actually, the lawyers don't need to know that, because by asking for true value, all you're really asking for is what a figure is in part of our calculation process. On its own is of no relevance, and possibly rather inflammatory sometimes if we quote it, because it's misunderstood and therefore can cause unnecessary debates. So hang with that for a moment, that we've got a John Lewis scheme. They've quoted 300,000, and actually the open market value, the DCFE, is 435,000. If I go back to this illustration and say, well, let's say step 1, and this is normally the approach we take, step 1 is that we will work out with no offsetting how we would create equality of income, because that, remember, is the starting premise of the work we do. In order to create equality of income, 61.5% share would have to go from the husband's John Lewis scheme to the wife, and that would create equality of income of £4,600. What you will notice is that the before figure was £12,000 and the after figure is £9,230. By sharing the pension, there's a destruction of value. That's not uncommon in final salary pensions. Now, there's 2 ways of approaching this. Let's say that it's recognized that in our offsetting work, or in our pension sharing work, we notice that that's poor value, and we are asked what offsetting could be, and it's useful to know what assets are available to offset. But essentially, we can offset anywhere between nothing, so we would do the equality of income 4,600 figure, or we can try and offset it all. And so anywhere between that range. And the way we would do that is that when we work out an offsetting value, that value could be via a pension fund. And what we've established from the previous slide is that if 435,000 somehow is funded into a pension fund for the wife, then it would provide an annuity income of £12,000 per annum. But you will note that it's a sliding scale. So you could do part thereof, because any element of that £12,000 you don't have to share is of benefit to both parties. That's the important thing to note, that rather than accept the full destruction of value, you can actually wind back from that. You could actually say, well, we can't fund into a pension, but there's enough other investment money available for us to buy a purchase life annuity with our joint matrimonial funds. That's an important element to mention. It's from joint matrimonial funds. And in that instance, it could be, in order to offset it all, could be 400,000. And the final aspect is, well, if there was money, investment money available, which they didn't want to pay into a purchase life annuity, because that's a one-off purchase, you can't get your money back, then if you were to put £296,000 into an investment and you got a certain rate of return over a certain period, so there's longevity to consider here and investment growth, then you could use that figure to offset. And of course, the decision between which of these methods to use will depend on the client's circumstances, which a financial planner who is a pension on divorce expert can help you with. So that's one way of looking at how you can offset that whole £12,000 out of joint matrimonial assets. If I go back to this creation of equality calculation, it might be that you've worked through this and there aren't, for whatever reason, they don't want to do offsetting. However, the husband has noticed that actually, if he could buy back his pension share, it might be quite significantly to his advantage. So what I'm going to look at now is what I'll call pension buyback. And the important difference here, and you might have to sit in a dark room with a cold towel around your head to think about this, is that if the husband wants to keep that £4,165 that was there to create equality, then he could do that, but that would have to be from his own funds, because that's a subsequent decision he's made, because it's been established in step one that equality of income produces £4,165. The wife is, in inverted commas, happy that that's a situation because that's a fair division. And the husband has then said, well, look, if you're happy with that £4,165, out of my own cash, I want to buy those pension benefits back, because the John Lewis scheme is really important, gives a poor value for money, so I want to buy those benefits back. And he can buy that back from either the family home or out of cash in the investments. And again, that can be, that value which we would calculate can either be via the pension fund, a purchase life annuity, or an investment. And there are always issues, and just to highlight those issues with each one of those, of course, funding a pension will necessitate consideration to be given to his annual allowance, and can enough money be funded into a pension to assist with that. When I've run my webinars on lifetime allowance, you'll note that sometimes pension contributions can upset the lifetime allowance protection. There's also tax considerations to be made here, as indeed there are with purchase life annuities. And investments can be, putting money into an investment can be a bit of a nightmare, because there's quite a lot more assumptions that need to be made. Engagement with the client sometimes is useful to try and establish what investment would be appropriate for their needs. their attitude to risk, their tax position, etc. So we do use investments and drawing down from investments as offsetting as an example, but it sometimes needs a further aspect of consideration.
Sorry to jump in there, Mark. But also with purchase life annuities, at the moment, nobody on the market does any underwriting. So if you have two 60-year-olds, one who's running marathons and the other who's missing a lung, they'll both get the same rate, which can add an extra complication for those.
Yeah. Thank you, Anthony. So if I move on from that, and I'm going back to this is the maths now. So I'm going back to my scenario where the husband has said, I want to buy back my share of the John Lewis scheme by ensuring that my wife will get £4,615 of gross income. And that can be via pension, an annuity purchase, as I've discussed before, purchase life annuity and investments. And if I look at the figures, then going back to the pension sharing calculation, if the wife ends up with £184,000 in her pension, she'll be able to buy an income of £4,615. The extra point to debate here, and this is where your head temperature will go up, is, well, do we suggest that the husband or the wife funds this? So could the husband fund himself, or could he give the cash to the wife to fund? And there's different consequences there. But nonetheless, £184,000 in a pension will give a gross income of that. For basic rate taxpayers, it will give a net income of £3,600. And the reason why I quote net income is because if the husband gave money to the wife to purchase a purchase life annuity, it pays net. Currently, the income from a purchase life annuity is not taxed, and therefore the net income, £3,692, would be generated by paying £123,000 into a purchase life annuity. And if we look at investments, again, the caveat is there's lots of tax angles here. But if you want to generate a net income of £3,600, you'd need £144,000 or £180,000 if you're looking to generate the full gross income. So there you go, you've got a bit of a range there. And as I've mentioned before, with this aspect, you've got investment risk and tax positions to consider as well. But having done this, of course, you and your client will have a range of figures to consider of which is most appropriate. And it might be that you choose to take an average. And I'm again returning to one of my earlier points, is if we understand what situation your client is and what you're trying to achieve and how much money is available for offsetting, so what you're thinking of, we can narrow this down to generally two appropriate figures. So we would give a range of offsetting figures, which in our experience is much more appropriate than burying you with the full range and perhaps you struggling to understand or your client understanding which is best for them. That's our job, as certainly this is our job as pension and divorce experts, and because we're financial planners and authorised to give financial advice, that we can add an awful lot. Although I say it myself, we can add a load of value as to, well, which is the right option for your client. So you're now in cool down mode, because I'm just going to summarize what we've gone through. And that is that, first of all, offsetting requests need to be quantified and perhaps a bit more detail added so that the pension and divorce expert can establish the correct methodology and whether there are any actions necessary. For example, funding a pension before you share it, which a an advisor who's authorized to give financial advice could put into their financial planning report. You got to have brought this up before in previous webinars. If you trust the pension and divorce expert to understand what the true values are of the scheme, you know, this John Lewis scheme, it's not worth 300,000, is worth 435,000. That's that, we know that we're going to do that as part of our calculations. It's relevant in equality of income calculations or offsetting, and that's what we do. The methodology we choose will be the most appropriate given the known circumstances of the client, and we will apply the methodology, of course, that maximizes the benefits to each party, with due consideration to trying to equalize style of pension income as well as quantity. We'll always provide a range on offsetting where it's appropriate. It's not always appropriate because of methods. There's some methods which aren't appropriate, but where possible, we'll provide a range. I've also mentioned that financial planning input can be helpful, not only from a pension funding point of view, but from an investment point of view, and to try and consider the whole context of your client's position. And that might be particularly relevant if we are acting as a single expert for you and your client to try and work out what a proposed pension share looks like for your client. Care, that should be with, not care will, but it should say care with full pension offsetting, because of course you do have some scenarios where you get something close to the wife saying, I'll have the house, you have the pension. Well, that's fine because it might solve a housing need now, but they may not thank you for that in retirement when they don't have any pension. And I think sometimes we can offer some pragmatic advice where there are other ways of achieving a result which might end up being able to house your client now, but ensure that when they do retire, they have some income. And I think throughout this, you'll perhaps realize that this is one area where it's quite easy to stray into offering financial advice, and to have a pension and divorce expert available as backup to perhaps offer that advice to your client rather than you might be quite useful. Standard slide here that you've all seen before. This is just some bullet points on what Blue Sky do, right from our willingness to discuss a case right up front before we're instructed, to shadow expert work, cash flow modeling work, all that sort of stuff. Let us know. So that's the end, but let us know what you think of this session. And here's the SurveyMonkey link, which I think one of my colleagues is going to drop into the chat box. So if you click on that link, hopefully it'll take you straight there and you can spend 2 minutes doing it. My sixth and final webinar is on Thursday, 20th of May at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And it's about pension sharing reports. What if your client doesn't want a pension sharing report? What are the advantages? I'm going to talk about, I don't really know what I'm going to talk about because I haven't done it yet, but it'll be what the alternatives are. I'm going to bring some highlights from perhaps the previous webinars to discuss which are relevant here. And if you get a client coming to you and there's a resistance for a pension sharing report, how can you work with your client to ensure they get a fair outcome? And very finally, if you would like to hear more from Blue Sky on occasion, we do our professional connections newsletters where you can be kept up to date with examples and thoughts of pension sharing. So I think that's the end of the webinar. I'm going to hand over to Jeremy and Anthony if there are any other questions that have come in or that are relevant to the audience. Gentlemen.
Well, we've got an anonymous one. Thinking of pension DC assets, what are the implications on sharing of a big age gap between husband and wife?
Well, that just goes back to the maths. You will let me just. Can you see those slides, Anthony?
Yep, I can see the PowerPoint presentation. So it's not.
If we're just looking at this slide, for example, the answer to the question is.
Hang on a second, Mark. I think I can see the PowerPoint screen, not the actual slide itself that you're looking for.
Oh, I see. Hang on a minute. Is that any different?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, you can see that. I know it's not the full thing, but here we go. On this slide, for example, the answer to that question is it's all in the maths, of course, because there's an age difference. You make allowance for the fact that one party might have more time to invest the money in offsetting, or might have a different annuity rate applied. So adjustments are made in the maths for people where there's a difference in age. That's probably an oversimplified answer, because it's as simple as saying, well, it's in the maths. If we know, we obviously will know the age of the client, and we make adjustments in offsetting for the fact that there'll be an age difference. So that all works through in the maths.
So yeah, fundamentally, the younger person's got longer for the assets to grow before they turn that into an income.
If that's the route we choose, yep. Okay. Anything else, Jeremy or Anthony? No.
Yep. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Sorry, we have a request from Laura to have a copy of the recordings and the slides, which of course is no problem to provide those. We do actually have a YouTube channel in case anybody is interested. So if you were to go onto YouTube and just type in Blue Sky Chartered Financial Planners, you would come across all of the webinars that Mark has done to date. So if you want to re-listen to some of those at your leisure, then they're all available for you.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, because I didn't know that. And of course, if you I listened to a YouTube webinar the other day in the car, because you can actually connect it to your, or for those who've got car electronics that allow it, you can connect your phone to the car and listen to a YouTube webinar without obviously looking at it. So if you're traveling, you can listen to these webinars in your car.
What better way to kill a journey, eh?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy. Anyway, shall we move on?
We've got one, I think, which is going to probably be more covered off in the next webinar, which is, are there any circumstances in which a simple CV split 50-50 would be fair and could be endorsed without a POD, such as parties type of pension, fund value, and length of marriage? If all schemes, or let's say we've got a simple situation where a husband's got a personal pension with 500,000 in it, and that's it, and they're both similar ages, both similar healths, it is quite reasonable to say, well, in this instance, we will share the pension 50-50 from a capital basis, because remember, we get unisex annuity rates. So that £500,000 pension fund will be split £250,000 each, and will buy annuity as the same annuity rate. So in those circumstances, yes. In previous webinars, the only caveat to that is just making sure that personal pension that I've just talked about, the DC scheme, doesn't have any hidden benefits like guaranteed annuity rates that might mean that the pension is a lot more valuable to the husband than the 500,000. So always worth checking. But if it's a modern day DC pension and that's all you're dealing with, splitting it 50-50 is reasonable. Thank you for that. We've got another one. Well, we've got two more, but I'll go for the more interesting one. No offense for the other chap. If we do not request your input as to the true value, could this not open us up to the prospect of a complaint if dealing with podes who are not as diligent as ourselves?
Well, look, I think the true value is an interesting one, and I think I will stay wedded to the fact that it's a complete irrelevance, because it's a figure that might be, it's of academic interest to know that in my example, it's the John Lewis scheme is £300,000, but it's on the open market to buy the same benefits would cost you 435. Well, so what? You can't do anything with that really, because if you share the pension, you're not sharing 435,000, you're sharing 300. It's very much part of a PODES process. It is a figure we would calculate in part of the process, but you're almost asking for a figure. What's that figure in the middle of a calculation? Well, we can tell you the figure, but it doesn't mean anything to you. You can't do anything with it. It's relevant to us, and your point about the PODE is possibly relevant, but you just have to make sure you go to a PODE who genuinely is a PODE and has got experience in this market and has got a good reputation, I suppose. But honestly, to the individual, it's kind of, well, it's interesting. No, it's a really poor value scheme, but a PODE will tell you that. A PODE will tell you that, and he'll adjust his figures because of that.
Thank you very much. So I suppose also, just if anyone's in doubt, give us a call, because we can always, if you're not sure whether you need to do any offsetting in a case, we can always just talk the case over and see if there's much mileage to be done.
Yeah. Right. Anything else? Anything else? Well, look, we've still got 61 people, so I assume those 61 people don't have any further questions. But just to say thank you for attending, and hope to see you all back here on 20th of May, I think I said it was. You'll get email reminders. So thanks very much, and okay. I'll end the.
Hang on a second, Mark. We still have one more unanswered, and there's also somebody here who's come up with a question which will probably be best done in a one-to-one phone call. And this is possibly a little bit on the speculation side, but what is the future for using joint life annuities, particularly with a big age difference?
Joint life annuities. Gosh, well, it depends on the circumstances. I'm pausing here because we've only ever used, that's an interesting one. We've only ever used single life annuities. Joint life annuities with big age differences. I'd have to think that one through. I think it would obviously be for the older. I would imagine it would be for much older people who wanted to buy an annuity and were happy for that to be a solution. And you'd have to make sure that a joint life annuity would be payable where a couple were divorced. So I'd have to, that would need a bit of research, because not all joint life annuities would pay out if they were divorced because they're no longer a spouse. So that's an interesting, that's another reason why I need to go and sit in a dark room with a cold towel on my head. I think I'll stop there because otherwise I'm going to waffle, but I hadn't really thought of it.
Mark, we've got another one, another question for you. This is concerning two of our favourite schemes, civil service and the police pension scheme. So the question is, I have a case involving civil service pensions and police pension scheme, and my advice to the client is she needs a PODE. Husband is putting pressure on, saying he has offered a pound for pound offset for her rehousing needs, which his solicitor supports. As if they get a PODE, it will be less than a pound for pound. This does not sit well with me. Joint value is £260,000. I see no alternative but to instruct the PODE, and I think our experiences dealing with the police pension scheme would say absolutely PODE required every time for these cases.
Well, absolutely, Jeremy. And in fact, if they ended up going to call for an FDR, then the first thing a judge would say is, this is a police scheme. in particular police scheme, we definitely need a PODE to deal with that. It's possibly one of the most extreme cases where, you know, the CE offered could be well below what the real value is. So yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, there is no way. I understand why husband's solicitor saying he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to get a pension sharing report done because it wouldn't be in his interest to. But you know, it's got to be done. Great. Are we done?
It looks like the questions have dried up now, Mark. So,
Well done.
so great work from you again. So brilliant, really good learning from that, I think.
Good. Well, thanks once again. Thanks everyone. Thanks for my facilitators, and see you next time.